I finished all 8 books for the 2025 Ursula K. Guin Award shortlist. Here are my thoughts. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me today. So today, I want to talk about the Ursula K. Guin Award for Fiction 2025. The award is going to be given out on the 21st of October. That's Ursula K. Le Guin's birthday. And I finished all 8 books on the shortlist. So I wanted to share my opinions and what book I think deserves to win the award. And then, this video should be out on the 17th of October. So just before the award is announced. And so when the award is announced, I will pin a comment down below saying who the actual winner is. But I thought I'd give my thoughts before the award was announced. Now, this year, I only started reading these books about 2 months ago, so I kind of crammed in all 8 books in these 2 months. Hopefully, moving forward next year, I'm already signed up for the newsletter, so I'll know right away when the short list is announced, and so hopefully I'll have a little more time to go through them. And that way I may be able to space out my reviews. But instead, for this year, I didn't do that, so I'm going to give you a quick review of all 8 books right now. The Ursula K. Le Guin Award for Fiction is an annual $25,000 award, and as per their website, it is a cash prize given to a writer for a single work of imaginative fiction, and the award is intended to recognize those writers who Ursula spoke about in her 2014 National Book Award speech, writers who are realists of a larger reality, who can imagine real grounds for hope and see alternatives to how we live now. So this year, there were 8 nominees that were shortlisted after an open submission, and then the Ursula K. Le Guin Foundation narrowed it down to a short list of 8, and then those 8 are being judged by a panel of 5 authors. The 5 authors this year are Matt Bell, Indra Das, Kelly Link, Sequoia Nagamatsu, and Rebecca Roanhorse. And as I said, the award will be announced on the 21st of October. So there are 8 books, and I'm going to go through them not really in order of least favorite to most favorite, but the one I think should win will be at the end. And I will draw your attention to what they say here, that it should be realists of a larger reality who can imagine real grounds for hope and alternatives to how we live now. Because at least one of the books that I really enjoyed, I'm not sure if it meets that prompt as well as other books that I didn't enjoy quite as much. So I'll get to that when we get to the end of the list. But let's go, at least in some rough order. These first 3 books I want to talk about are somewhat avant-garde books, or they're not traditional narratives. The first one to talk about then is Rakesfall by Vajra Chandrasekara. This is a story of 2 individuals as they live multiple lives over and over and over again, and reborn over and over and over again. And it starts in the distant past when they are chanting around a fire and, casting spells. And it goes all the way to the far, far future when there are AI overlords that are, ruling over a world that has been, devastated by climate change and so forth. And you see these same individuals being reborn again and again. And now, I think the language in this book was incredible. It was really lush, it was dense, it was really wonderful to read. The writing itself and the atmosphere and the world building was all really intricate and evocative, and I really enjoyed spending time in it. There isn't a strong narrative, and the characters, even though they were born again and again and again, they didn't really know that, right? It wasn't like they engaged in some action that caused them to die, and then they knew they were being reborn. So it wasn't a continual memory that went through all their lives. We, as the readers, figured out how they related to past lives and how they emerged in the future. And it's looking at the idea of history from the perspective of myth, right? And how myth and reality have to exist simultaneously, like they overlap. And we use mythology as a way to understand our own humanity. And so it's exploring these 2 individuals and the way their lives constantly weave in and out of one another through this mythological lens as a way to understand something better about humanity, right? And so I think that's very interesting. And I had a really fun time with the book, but there isn't a strong narrative, right? So the language itself is what helped pull me through, because not only is there really not a strong narrative, you don't get too strong of a sense of character, because these characters are constantly changing and evolving, and they're referencing back to who they used to be, and that is influencing their present whenever their present may be. But their evolution is so continual that you don't really dig into a heart of any of these of either of these 2 characters. So there isn't the kind of character depth that I usually look for. Now, there is a lot of character depth, but as the characters are constantly changing, that character depth is spread across the whole novel, if that makes sense, and multiple permutations of any individual character. So This was an interesting book. I really enjoyed reading it. The language itself, the prose at a prose level was really beautiful. The ideas were very heady, and I enjoyed spending time with them. But it didn't have the kind of narrative that really pulls me in. So in that regard, it wasn't my favorite. But I did appreciate the kind of experimental narrative style and what he was going for with it. So it's definitely worth checking out if that sounds interesting to you, this experimental narrative that is linear in a mythological scale, not linear in like a human lifetime scale. The next book to talk about then, also a little bit experimental, is Remember You Will Die. This is by Eden Robbins. And this is an epistolary novel told mostly through obituaries, though sometimes there are news reports and similar things like that mixed in, but the vast majority of it is obituaries. And all of these obituaries, to one extent or another, are circling around an embodied AI who had a child. And you are searching to try to understand where this child is now, at whatever this point is in the future. And these obituaries, they build off of each other. So the experience of reading this is like falling down an internet rabbit hole. So the first obituary may mention another person, and then you get to the next obituary and you realize, oh, this was that person mentioned in that last one. And then that obituary might, mention an artist commune. And then the next obituary is going to be the director or the founder of that artist commune, and so forth. So they aren't linear. They're going back and forth in time, and they are going from obituary to news report to manifesto back to obituary, and they're moving in circles. And through this piecemeal relationship between these obituaries, you learn all these different characters, eventually how they all relate to this AI, this embodied AI, and as well as the daughter that she had. In this kind of plethora of obituaries, it's looking at artists and activists and scientists especially, and the interaction between AI and computer science and creativity, as well as social activism. And so these are the main kind of characters we see recurring throughout these different types of obituaries. I will say the experience of it was really engaging because the experience didn't feel linear. It felt like you were being sucked into a vortex. It felt like you were falling down an internet rabbit hole. Like you're reading an article and you see something interesting, so you open up that link in a new tab, but you keep reading the article. And then all of a sudden you notice you have a dozen new tabs opened, and they're only tangentially related to wherever you are in whatever you're researching. That's what this felt like. It felt like you have dozens of tabs open in your window, and you're going through them, and at one point they were related to something you were reading, and now they're just all over the place, ostensibly focusing on one topic or sprouting off of one topic. That's what it feels like. You really have this sensation of falling down an internet rabbit hole, and that is a really interesting way to engage in narrative, that it's not linear, but it circles around itself. And it asks questions about humanity and about sentience and about death, for that matter. But it does it through this lens of artistic endeavors and creativity, which I think is really, really interesting. So you get a bigger picture of the world that they're living in that gives birth to this artistic movement from which you find this embodied AI, and how this AI then manages a way to have a child. So again, very similar to Rakesfall, there isn't a strong narrative. It is all these different pieces that you have to put together, and then when you take a step back, you see a bigger picture. And so in that regard, it is exciting, right, to be part of this story and to see how all these little things fit together, sometimes neatly, but sometimes not so neatly. And in that regard, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the novel, use of obituaries in this epistolary format. Usually when you're reading an epistolary novel, it's diary entries or letters or things like this. So to have it based in obituaries is a really interesting concept, right? And it's really exploring the idea of life, what it means to be alive, what it means to be in community with others. And does that community end on the death of your body? Is the death of your body the death of all that is, right? So it asks these interesting questions, and focusing on obituaries is a smart way to do that. Again, for me, I really wanted a little more narrative, so the experimental nature of this didn't hit my sweet spot, but it might for you. I can appreciate there are a lot of people that would find this kind of storytelling really engaging. For me, it was interesting. I liked the world that was built out, but I just felt like I was missing a little bit of something there. Do you know what I mean? Then moving on to the third one that I think is a little bit experimental, and that is North Continent Ribbon by Ursula Whitcher. And this is a collection of short stories that all take place on the same world, the same planet. And through those short stories, you discover an image of this world. But the short stories aren't following the same characters. And from the first one to the last one, a couple hundred years have passed. So you're getting a very, large picture of this world. And one of the short stories follows a bodyguard, one follows a politician, one follows a sex worker, one follows a student. The last one follows a sentient spaceship. And so you have all these different angles into humanity and into society. And the picture they paint is one of kind of a hyper-capitalism with a working class who is, there is some movement rather, to engage in like class solidarity and to create unions to push back against this capitalist regime that is exploiting workers. And so you see that within each of the stories to one extent or another. And the culture and the communities that she describes in these stories are all really interesting. I mean, I enjoyed it. I thought all the stories were great, actually. I really enjoyed all the stories. But I would have liked one novel for any one of those stories because she did such a good job of creating characters and creating a world that in any one of those stories, it could have been expanded to a novel and I would have been there for it. Or even a novella, if not a full novel. Every one of these stories was great. And as short stories, they were effective. And as a collection of short stories, they really did paint this broad picture of this world, right? But I mean, no buts about it. It was a fun collection of stories. I enjoyed every single one of the stories. And taking a step back, I enjoyed the world that was kind of painted, through these stories. But it felt more like a watercolor painting of a world that you had to step back to see. And it didn't give like a vivid overall picture of the world because it was going through a few centuries of history and following from all different aspects, from different parts of society, different parts of community, different places on the economic ladder. So in that regard, I had a fun time with this collection. I would have liked any one of these stories to be expanded into a novella or to a novel because I think they all had the ideas that could have withheld that level of scrutiny. And so having this collection of short stories, while I enjoyed them, I wanted more. I was left wanting more. So I think my kind of critiques for these first three novels, Rakesfall by Vajra Chandrasekara, Remember You Will Die by Eden Robbins, and North Continent Ribbon by Ursula Whitcher, is simply that they do create interesting worlds, but they don't have a strong enough narrative to pull me into those worlds and to give me a full picture of those worlds. You get those worlds at remove, right, at a distance, from taking all these disparate pieces and putting them together, which is a fun experience, and it's an interesting way to engage in storytelling. But I think that with all of them, I had the same feeling of wanting a little bit more narrative and something that pulled me into this world in a more clear way. Like I wanted the world set with greater relief and not this pseudo amorphous thing that you had to step back in order to get a picture of. Do you know what I mean? So I think all three of them, I have the same kind of complaint that they were all written really well. They all had interesting language. They all had interesting ideas. All of them had ideas about identity and about your place in society, about what it means to be a member of community, especially. And so I appreciate all those. I wanted a little bit more narrative from all of them. So the fourth one is The West Passage by Jared Pechaček. And now this one, I have to say, it had a narrative, a strong narrative. It was maybe my least favorite of the 8. It wasn't bad, but it was very rambly. And so the main concept was, imagine a world where it's a giant city, but the giant city is made up of these 5 castles, you can say, or towers. And each tower is essentially its own mini city. To get from one tower to the next takes, 3-4 days journey, give or take. And in these towers, there are these they refer to them in the jacket copy as eldritch deities, but these non-human, monstrous deities called the ladies of the towers, and they rule the individual towers. Some of them have been ruling for millennia, and others have died and are replaced by their offspring, and they all rule in different ways. So you have this kind of timeless city. It feels like, medieval Europe, but it has this odd aspect of there being these almost eldritch deities that rule over these different parts of the city. And it almost feels like 5 different cities, even though there's supposedly one city-state with 5 different areas or sections, but it feels almost like 5 distinct cities because the ladies of these 5 towers are constantly fighting. We have 2 protagonists who are both from the Grey Tower, and the Grey Tower has the sense of being left behind. The lady from the Grey Tower has died millennia ago or a long time ago. You don't know when. You don't have any memory of her. So they are left ladyless. And our main characters, one of them is a nun. There's only 2 full nuns left and 3 novices. And so there are so few left. When they go to have dinner together, the dining room seats hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And it's just the 5 of them sitting at the one small end of a table. So you have this feeling of being left behind. Right? So one of our protagonists is this nun. Then the other protagonist is an apprentice to the protector. So the protector is supposed to protect the whole realm from the beast. And the beast is another eldritch deity that rises up from under the earth every couple hundreds of years and comes from the West Passage to the city. So that's why it's called the West Passage. The protector is supposed to protect the West Passage and stop the beast from destroying the city, from killing all the ladies. And the very beginning of the story, the protector dies. And so the apprentice has never, stepped up to really adopt the full role of protector, but he has to now. And so you have the apprentice who, one last mission, he is going to one of the other towers on behalf of the protector who just died, because he told her that he would fulfill this like one thing for her. So he is going to another tower on behalf of the protector to try to kind of level up his game. And one of these nuns is also leaving to go to another tower to try to get more information about what's going on, because at that point, even though it's the middle of summer, all of a sudden winter has come, and winter is not going away, and it's destroying everything. And they believe this may be a sign of the beast. They don't know. So one of the nuns is going on a mission to figure out what's going on, to kind of try to fix things. And this apprentice protector is also going on a mission. And so that idea I appreciate, right? You learn more history about this town, the city, as you go, as they get lost in their travels. They're not going together, they're going separately. But it just felt really, really rambling. It was hard to get any sense of geography. It was hard to get a sense of place. There were really cool illustrations before every chapter that looked like the illustrations you'd find in medieval manuscripts. So those I appreciated. And some of them showed, finally near the end, they showed like a map of the area and where all the towers were located. But before that, it was really hard to get a sense of place. And I appreciate the ideas behind it, behind the whole story. And I think the journey that both of these characters went on was interesting, both the external journey and the internal journey. But it just felt like it felt like it was pulled out way too long, and it was just going around in circles in ways that it took a long time for anything to happen. So the world building was interesting. There were lots of little details here and there that I thought were really engaging, and they kept me intrigued with the world. And how intricate the world was really captivating, but it was hard to feel enamored for the bigger picture because everything was just doled out so slowly that I really didn't have a fun time trying to piece everything together. I really appreciated the world building and the characters, but the plotting just didn't quite work, and there was like a little bit, I don't want to say sloppiness, but it was just hard to get a sense of place and hard to understand how these characters existed in this bigger world, both in a geographic sense, but also in like a psychological and emotional sense, because the world has this hundreds of years of history and every character only knows a small amount of it. So you have nothing but non-reliable narrators who don't really know what's going on, which is an intriguing premise, but it just isn't able to fulfill the promises of that premise. You're just left at the end feeling like everything happened conveniently. The writing was engaging. The world building was really fantastical, and a little bit, it managed to have this really dark tone, but be very whimsical at the same time. So to balance this darkness and this whimsy, I thought was an interesting combination, and that was done well. So I appreciated a lot of the writing, but overall, it didn't do it for me. So those are the bottom four. Now they aren't. It's not to say that they're my least favorite. Though I will say the West Passage was my least favorite of all of them. But the other ones, it's not to say they'd be in the bottom of the ones I enjoyed. But they're the ones I think least likely to win this award because they felt like they were missing something, if you know what I mean. So moving on to the top four. Now the next one. Now this one I think is my second favorite of all the ones I read. I don't think it really meets the necessary prompt of envisioning a world that's an alternative to where we live now. So I don't think this one will win, but I did really enjoy it. And this is The City in Glass by Nghi. This is a novella, and it takes place in a world that's, I don't know if it's not an island. It might be an archipelago that is the city that was created by this demon. And as you're introduced to the city, you meet the demon and you learn how she's been building the city for hundreds of years. And for no reason, a bunch of angels just rock in and raze the city to the ground. They burn everything to the ground. They don't even give a reason why. They just show up and they destroy everything. And so she's left with nothing, and she marks one of them. She tries to fight back, but she's nothing compared to these angels. And so she's able to mark one of them, but then they destroy her too. Now you can't really kill a demon, so she has to rebuild herself out of like the muck from the bottom of the ocean. She finally comes back into being, and there's nothing left of her city. So she is determined to rebuild it. But it takes her, a century just to convince the river to run back through the city. So she's using all of her magic just to reroute the river that has been burned away. So you can see it's a long period of time that she's working on. And as she's trying to rebuild her city, to face the destruction and to look at destruction and still have hope, that angel that she marked comes back. He says, I can't get back in heaven because you've marked me. So you have to take this mark away. And she refuses. So he's like, fine, well then I'll help you build your city. And maybe when the city is done, then you'll take the mark away. But she doesn't want his help. So there's this really interesting relationship between the demon and the angel who at some points are just constantly fighting, and at some points are drawn to each other. So they're like magnets, and depending on which way the wind blows is which type of polarity they're facing that day, whether they're drawn together or pushing apart. And you just see this really engaging practice of trying to build a city from nothing and trying to look at the work you've been doing your whole life that has been destroyed for no reason, and instead of giving in to despair, saying, okay, I can do it again. I can find some sort of hope. I can find something in me that is a source of perseverance and a source of joy that I can bring to others. And using that, I can build the city again. I can repair the damage that was done to me. And so it's a story about repairing damage. And she does interact with the humans. Some of the humans see her, some don't. It's not that they realize she's a demon. Some do, some don't. Like, it's the mythological aspects and the magical aspects are like subdued. It's just like a medieval city, essentially. It has a really beautiful library, or it used to have a beautiful library. Of course, that was burned down, but she's intent to rebuild the library again. And, the city isn't perfect. There are, thieves, and there are dangerous people, but there are also artisans, and, there's a mixture of everything. And she wants to make this well-balanced city where people can find life, they can find joy. And so that is the whole novel. Right. And so it has a couple different relationships. She does have relationships with humans, especially at the end, and you follow her relationships with one particular lineage of humans near the end of the story. Before that, you also have a relationship between her and the angel, but ultimately it's the relationship between her and herself as manifest through the city, and her looking at the destruction of all of her life's work, and instead of letting that beat her down into nothing, like standing up again and saying, I can rebuild it. I can get over this trauma, I can get over this pain, and I can create something new, something worthwhile, something filled with love and joy and compassion. Even though this destruction came from nowhere, for no reason, with no explanation, I don't have to let that haunt me for my whole life. I don't have to let that hold me back from doing what I feel is important. So it's a story about resiliency, and it's a story about triumph over, unimaginable odds. And so in that regard, I thought it was beautiful. I thought the prose was really great. I thought the characterization of the angel and the demon were both really interesting. The relationship they had, the constant push and pull of it, and just the determination that she had to look at this destruction and not let it hold her back. So the story of finding yourself and what it means to be yourself, and how even when everything seems like it's against you, seems like you have an impossible task, instead of letting that overwhelming you, finding the strength to look at that and be motivated to keep going forward anyway. I think it's a really beautiful story that talks about all those things. So I don't think this one is probably going to win, but it doesn't feel like it meets the brief 100%, but I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great story. Now, the next two stories, I think have a better chance of winning than this one because they meet the brief really well of imagining a future that is an alternative to how we live now. Now, there are things about them that made me not enjoy them as much as The City in Glass, but they were both really good. So of these two, the first one is Blackheart Man by Nalo Hopkinson. This takes place on an imaginary Caribbean island, essentially. The language is really beautiful the whole time. It's written in a vernacular that is somewhat of an imagined vernacular, but also based in contemporary Caribbean vernaculars that are kind of mixed together, as well as some Western African vernaculars mixed in. And this island, it fought off colonization, and that was one of their marks of pride, that the white colonizers, essentially, they were able to fend them off, and that is part of their natural history and their identity of who they are. And the way they fought them off was through magic. And there was a colonizing force that they used magic somehow to cause them all to sink into these tar pits and disappear. Now, at the beginning of this story, one of these soldiers from hundreds of years ago that's buried in the tar has come back to life, and you don't know why. So there's something fantastical, something magic happening. And that soldier, along with the others that are all buried in the tar, are making their way out of the tar. Now, at the same time, our main character is a historian, but here the historians are griots. They are singers. They sing history. They record all of the history of their peoples in song. And so he's learning how to do that. He's also preparing to get married. Here in this world, marriages happen between a woman and two husbands, so it's always a tripartite marriage. So he is preparing to get married. He's also like finishing up his education as a historian and a singer. At the same time, the colonizing force that they've beaten away have come back, and they say they're there to trade, that they want to trade, but obviously they have all these ships in the harbor and they have other ideas. So you have these multiple storylines going on at the same time. The colonizers have returned ostensibly for trade, but probably not. And then he is trying to finish his studies. He's also kind of known as a rabble rouser, like he's got a reputation around town, and he's preparing to get married. And meanwhile, one of the colonizers that comes back was someone that was born on this island but had left as a child because he didn't think the island had anything for him, or he left as a young man rather. So now he is part of the colonizing force that is returning. So all these things are happening at once. And that is where the story falls apart a little bit for me. I think the characters are all somewhat surface level. They're interesting, they're all colorful, they're exciting, they have a lot of ideas, and this play between old gods and history and superstition and magic and contemporary science and what is actually happening and what is imagined, those are interesting things, right? But they're all just touched upon very quickly. Because meanwhile, at the same time, as you have some sort of magic causing these warriors to come up, these long dead warriors, I might say, to come out of the tar pits, there's also an instance where a whole lot of the island's children disappear. And they believe they're taken by the Blackheart man. So the Blackheart man, where you get the title of the novel, is this mythological figure who is, like a source of all evil for the island, who has nothing but bad intentions for the island. And all these children, they believe, were taken by the Blackheart man, who is probably the same person that is causing these warriors to rise out of the tar pits to then aid the colonizers who've returned to overtake the island, overtake what they couldn't take, hundreds of years ago. So all these things are happening at the same time, and they weave in and out of each other, but they feel like separate plot lines. And our main character, he feels very shallow. It's explained to you how he's well-rounded, but you don't experience that. And the same with all of the ancillary characters. You're explained their history, but you don't experience it. So they feel just somewhat surface level, even though you have this colorful depiction of them and this exploration of how they are in the community. It's told to you. It's not something you experience. I think the world of this island, though, is quite engaging. It's a non-capitalist system, so it's mostly bartering, but they also have a relationship that is based in community and based in understanding where you came from to create something new for the future. So the willingness to protect their island and to look at the gods who they believe, or the goddesses really, who rule the island, both the mythological goddesses and those goddesses as embodied by certain humans who are on the island, including his future daughter. The interplay between mythological history and contemporary life is really exciting. The community that they build is really exciting. The type of relationships that are explored, I think, is fun, engaging, and very forward-thinking. So I loved so much about the world building. The world building is astounding, and the writing used to describe that world building is also really beautiful, really evocative, like I mentioned, colorful. It brings you in. You get a sense of place really strongly. I just think it was missing a little bit on character depth, and it was missing a little bit on narrative. I would have liked maybe some of these narratives to be trimmed back, because there were so many different things happening. And yes, they wove into each other, but none of them were given the depth I think they could have used. That would have served the story better if any one of those narratives was given a little more meat, and instead it was just kind of, they each were glanced upon. They didn't have the depth that I would have liked. But it was a really engaging read. It was a quick read. And now I listened to the audiobook, and I think that helped because the language and the vernacular that was used was so different that hearing it really brought you into the experience. But I also imagine reading it on the page would have a similar effect. The next one to talk about is Archangels of Funk by Andrea Hairston. And this has a similar situation where I think the world building is incredible. And now here the characters, I think, are much more intricate and engaging and have really interesting histories, but there just isn't enough narrative to keep me interested. So the premise is it takes place in the near future, like 2050 or so, and our main character, Cinnamon, is a woman who's in her 50s, and she's putting on a huge festival. And she does this festival every year, and it's done on her father's birthday, and it's coming up in 2 days. And so the whole plot is for the festival to happen. So the whole first half of the book essentially is, the day, 2 days before the festival, then you have the festival, and then you have a short period after the festival. Now, meanwhile, the world that is built is, an extension of where we're going right now, this hyper-capitalist state. So you don't really hear a lot. It takes place in Western Massachusetts, I should say. The world has suffered great different climate devastation, so it's Western Massachusetts, but it's not quite the temperate Western Massachusetts that you might think of. And due to this hyper-capitalism, you don't really hear a lot about the federal or state governments, but you do hear a lot about the companies, that basically the companies are what are in charge of the area. The companies have hired guards. The police force doesn't exist. What exists is the guards who protect the private property of these billionaire companies, right? And a large focus of the companies is AI. And the people that are the working class and the working poor, it's a gig economy that you're just struggling to survive, right? So that is the environment. Now, our main character lives on a farm co-op that she inherited from her grandparents. She used to be a great coder, and she was doing work in AI. And in fact, she has these 3 AI bots that were trained on her grandparents. So it's like she has her ancestors with her all the time in the form of these 3 AI bots. But she left her job as a coder at one of these big companies for reasons that you discover. And she now lives on a farm that's a co-op, and she's part of this group that is like a very communitarian-based group. They call it the Ghost Mall. They've taken over this abandoned mall where they give out free meals every day to people, and they give free schooling and free education and free training. And it's really much like community-based organizing where they exist outside of this capitalist system, on the fringes of it, and just trying to like feed off of the scraps to create a system that celebrates art, celebrates joy, celebrates creativity, celebrates community. It doesn't look for punishment, but instead looks for rehabilitation. And that is the community rather that she's part of. And so she goes back and forth between this farm and then this community, and through that she's putting on this festival. And now, meanwhile, there are all these subplots happening. There are spies that are trying to steal her AI, which seems like pretty continuous. There are always just like dangerous militia who are coming through for no reason but their own personal ends. The fantastical and the magic exist in this world, but whether they really exist or if they exist in her mind, and in the minds of some of the characters around her, is up for debate. Like, the story is left really wide open in that way, which I appreciate. The writing is incredibly stylized. On every page, someone might just drop into slam poetry while someone does beatboxing behind them for no reason. And it can be a lot. It can be a lot. I'm not gonna lie. I appreciated it, but it felt like a lot at times. You know what it felt like is, if you have ever seen the musical Rent, which is a musical from the mid-90s that is based on La Boheme by Puccini. The end of the first act of Rent, there is actually a performance, a piece of performance art that turns into a protest, and then everyone goes to a cafe, and there is like the finale of Act 1 is a song called La Vie Boheme. This whole story feels like it takes place during La Vie Boheme. The way people talk, the way they are engaging in art, they speak in aphorisms, and they're always referencing the ancestors and the ancestors' wishes and how that creates a new future. But they speak in like these witty aphorisms, and they speak in poetry, and they speak in song, and they're constantly rapping and engaging in like, beatboxing competitions for no reason at all. And that mixes with these AI bots who embody the lives of these ancestors who tell stories. So storytelling and creativity is the heart of this community building enterprise, right? The whole idea is how we can imagine a new future for ourselves, but that future has to come from artistic creativity and from solidarity. So even there are people in this story who engage in pretty harmful, destructive acts, and instead of looking for punishment, they look for ways to bring them into the fold so they won't feel a need to engage in that harm in the future. So I really like the politics of it. I like the ideas of it. The language, like I said, is very stylized. I appreciated it in small doses, but over the whole course of the novel, it felt like a little bit too much. But what the character is really interesting. We have the main character, Cinnamon, and then you have a couple other characters who, are in charge of the Ghost Mall, and you get from their perspective once in a while. And there are 2 dogs, and every once in a while you get chapters from the dogs' perspectives. I really liked the storytelling. I liked the language. I liked the world. I liked the sense of hope, the sense of urgency, the importance of understanding who you are and where you came from, and using that to tell new stories about your future, to not letting a sense of despair or gloom get in the way, especially when you're living in this hyper-capitalist state where everything is devastated due to these climate emergencies that have been going on for decades. Not letting any of that hold you back from the inner life that is important, that is based on not only art and creativity, but creating community with others. I love all of that. Language, like I said, sometimes a little too much, but in small doses, I really appreciated just the tenor of it, the rhythm it gave you. But it didn't feel like there was a narrative. Like I said, there are all these competing things happening. There are some antagonists coming in and some leaving, and some antagonists becoming friends. But really, it's just, let's get this festival going on. The festival didn't really happen the year before because there were all these problems, or it didn't happen correctly. It was poorly attended, whatever it may be. So having it happen this year is really important, but she doesn't know if she really wants to do it, and she's a little bit down and she's not sure, blah, blah, blah. But that's it. Like, that's the whole plot. I wish there was more narrative. And then when you get to the acknowledgments after the story is done, you find out, this is a sequel. There had been another book starring the same character, which you didn't need to read this. I knew that before reading it. And everything I read said you don't need to know that story going in. But she had written that book, And then before writing this book, she was asked to write a short story. So she wrote a short story as like the engine of starting this novel. And then she wrote another short story. And then she wrote a full-on play, which was then mounted and performed for over a year. And then those short stories and that play came together with some other ideas to become this novel. And it feels like that. It feels piecemealed. Like it doesn't have one strong narrative plot that goes through the whole story, but it just has a bunch of ideas put together that are then encapsulated in this idea of this performance of a festival. And I would have loved, again, I don't need plot. I don't need narrative. I know it seems like that. Talking about these 8 novels, that's what I have been kind of missing the most, is having a strong narrative. I don't need that, but if your characters are going to be so ethereal and all over the place, and if your language is going to be so stylized and so like heady that it takes effort to really get into it, you need something to ground the story. And I love all the ideas, I love the world building, but all of these where I'm complaining that there isn't enough plot, or there isn't enough narrative rather, it's because everything else is so ethereal that nothing is grounding it. You need something to ground it, at least in my experience, for my personal, reading style or my reading pleasure. So if you're not going to have the characters based in, a pragmatic reality, but instead they're going to be these artistic, ethereal, ideas, then I want something to keep me engaged in the story. So I wish there was a little more narrative, because I really like the characters. I like the world. It just didn't come together to me. It was tiring sometimes to read it because the language was so stylized, but I couldn't tell what it was pointing at. Except for this festival performance, which is exciting, but it doesn't feel like it anchors the story in the way that it needs to. So in that regard, I was a little bit disappointed. Though I did, like I said, I liked the world building, especially I liked the sense of hope and urgency. And if anything, I think this has a good chance of winning because the world created and is very much focusing on community values and focusing on rehabilitation and not punishment, and focusing on taking care of others in a meaningful way and finding a new future that is inclusive and is based on understanding your past and understanding storytelling as a means of creation, I think is really powerful. And so I think in that regard, this has a good chance of winning the award because it really meets the brief of, presenting an alternative to the world we live in now, especially because the world these people in this story have carved out for themselves exist in opposition to this hyper-capitalist state that is really destroying the world and is in charge of everything. And they have tried to find their way on the margins and on the periphery of that. So with that regard, I think there is a good chance for this one to win. This one and Blackheart Man both, I think, have a good chance of winning. Even if I think their narratives weren't the strongest, I think they did a good job of world building and presenting this world that is very optimistic. But now the final one of the 8 on the shortlist, and this was my favorite, and I think it also has the best chance for winning, or I think it should win, because I think it meets the brief and also was a really engaging narrative. And this is The Sapling Cage by Margaret Killjoy. And this takes place in, again, what you could think of as like a medieval Europe, right? That's the overall vibe you get. But there are a number of different fiefdoms, essentially, and each has their own ruler. There are dukes and duchesses. There's one duchess who is trying to consolidate power. And now each of the rulers have their own set of knights. And then there are also these kind of renegade knights who don't work for anyone, who are just trying to work for the people. And the people are mostly living a rural or bucolic life. And our main character wants to be a witch because they're also witches. And the witches are anarchists, essentially. The witches travel from place to place. They don't pledge allegiance to any of the rulers. They don't think any of the rulers have the right to rule humans. And they do practice magic, and they just try to help people with their magic, but they also use their magic proactively and defensively when they need to. And in this world, only women can be witches. So our main character is a young girl. She's 16, but she was born a boy. But she knows she's a girl and she wants to be a witch. She's always wanted to be a witch. Her best friend, on the other hand, was promised to the witches for something that happened in the past. Now, her best friend is an orphan, lives on her own, and they know the witches are coming through town, and her best friend has to go with them. So she says, look, I'll take your place. And her best friend wants to be a knight. And the knights, you can take men and women, but the witches only take women. So her best friend is like, okay, you take my place, you can be a witch, and I'll go be a knight. And that is their plan. And so that's how the story starts. And she joins with these witches who travel through. So at the beginning, you have this sense of fear that she's going to be found out and that there's going to cause some friction there. But then the main plot that you find out that's happening is that someone has been stealing magic, essentially. Now, there are different types of magic in this world, which I think is really engaging. The witches that we follow practice this type of magic where they can see what they call ley. And the ley comes in different colors, and it's based on the geography of a place and the inhabitants of the place and the history of that place. So different places have different magical properties, and they're able to see that magic as it flows like a river in any given place. And then once they can see it, they can use it, manipulate it to engage in spell work and other things like this. The magic exists in the place, but depending on your mindset, the way you experience the magic then creates the limitations of how you can use it. But in any case, there are some people that somehow are taking the magic from a place and they're stealing it. And they are trapping it in these golden cages where these saplings grow, hence the title, the sapling cage. And so the witches have decided they have to figure out who's doing this, because as this is happening, the townspeople are all turning against the witches. And the Duchess, who is trying to consolidate her power, is putting all the blame on the witches. So they decide they need to figure out who is engaging in stealing all this magic. And also it's dangerous, because when you can consolidate this magic, then it becomes much more powerful and anyone can use it, right? So there is a little bit of a gatekeeping. Like, they don't like the fact that anyone can use this magic when they can just go to this cage where this magical sapling is growing and just tap into that, because the witches have to go through all this work to figure out how to see magic, how to manipulate magic, how to use it to their own ends. They don't have to just go to this ready-made, magic for everyone. So there is a little bit of gatekeeping, which I think is interesting. But the witches themselves are fundamentally anarchists. So their idea of government is that you need to do what's right for you, but in so doing, you're taking care of others at the same time. And you get what you deserve insofar as you're giving something to others and then you get in response. And everyone therefore works together to create a better whole for all of society, right? So it's not pure anarchism, but it's moving towards anarchism. And that's why they're a wandering group. They're homeless, essentially. And so this young girl has joined the witches. And what I really appreciate about the story is that the world building, I think, is exquisite. It seems like this very simple, bucolic, medieval Europe, but then you have these elements of these renegade knights, and you have this magic, and you have these witches, and you have this lust for power on the part of the people that are already in control. And then you have other fantastical creatures that live in the forests in some places, as well as like monsters that live in some places. So there's these fantastical elements. In that regard, it's a pretty normal second world fantasy. But the world is created with this really beautiful attention to detail that I appreciate. And the way our characters exist in the world is really meaningful. And as the characters are traveling through the world, you get to see different aspects of it, different small towns and so forth. So I think the world building is done really well. I think the character work is exquisite with our main character, but also all of the ancillary characters. There are a number of witches that you meet. Our small group of witches meets up with other covens, because in order for the witches to make decisions as a whole, all the covens have to come together. So there's a number of covens, and they don't like meeting in any one place for too long. There are people that wish harm against the witches, so they don't stay in any one place for too long. But so these covens have to come together to have this big meetup to decide what to do. So you meet other covens, you meet other trainees, and you meet witches at different levels of their practice. You get to meet knights, some of whom are these renegade, awesome, like almost anarchic knights, and some who are just like the police, who are doing nothing but brutalizing people and stealing money, but doing it in the name of the crown. So throughout the story, you have this, wide cast of characters, and a number of ancillary characters are given these really interesting backstories and a lot of depth, and they feel genuine, they feel real, they feel complete and fully rounded. And so spending time with these characters is really exciting and engaging. Learning about magic with the characters is really fun. When they can see magic, when they can see ley for the first time, is like really, really exciting. And they're learning what it means to be themselves, right? These young girls who have been promised to the witches, who are now becoming witches, and as they join with these covens, they have to fight against this terrible evil that, hasn't been seen in such a long time. So they're like trial by fire in many ways. So I think, everything about the story, it feels very gentle in many regards, even though the stakes are quite high. But it really is focused on this idea of community and of caring for others. And the work the witches do isn't selfish, right? It's taking care of their community of witches, but also the larger community of everyday people who just need things the witches can do that they can't do on their own. So they travel like traveling medics or traveling clerics almost. And I really appreciate this idea of community and of service. And the witches are ostracized because they're devoted to service, right? They aren't devoted to capital. They aren't devoted to power. They aren't devoted to doing what the law says. They're devoted to doing what is morally right to do. And the morally right thing is the revolutionary thing quite often. So these anarchic, queerish witches, I think, are really exciting. And I will say, in this story, our main character, like I said, is a trans girl, and that she has this internal fear that she's going to be found out and be kicked out of the witches, and I like that that isn't the main problem in the story. And in fact, other people discover that she was born a boy by the middle of the story. Not everyone, but others do. So it isn't a secret that is hidden in the whole story, only to be revealed in the last chapter. And you have some people who think it's fine and some who are a little bit testy about it. So it's not like it just gets hand waved away, but it isn't like this like terrible, awful secret eating away at her whole story, you know? There are other people who discover her secret and they don't care. They care about who she is as a person. And so she has allies starting at an early part in the story. And she herself always knows who she is. There's no self-loathing. You know, there's fear that she's going to be found out and be kicked out of the witches because all she's wanted her whole life is to be a witch. So there's that fear there, but it's not fear about her not knowing who she is. And so I appreciate that her identity and her gender identity is a source of tension in the story, but it's not the primary source of tension. And it isn't, you know, something that is guarded as the secret for the whole duration of the story. It is a secondary obstacle to the story. The main obstacle is that this magic is being stolen and being used for nefarious purposes, right? While at the same time, this one duchess is trying to consolidate power. And arguably, the witches believe that these two things are going hand in hand, right? That the consolidation of magic and the use of magic is an effort to allow this one woman to rule. And whether or not that's true, and everyone has, you know, divided loyalties, that is all kind of uncovered as they discover more and more about the mystery and who are these people that are doing this magic and are stealing this magic. But so I like that. I like that her identity as a person is important to the story. It's not incidental. It's important to her as a person, and it's important to her as part of her journey. But the story doesn't revolve only around that, right? That is just part of who she is and part of her journey, but the story itself is much bigger. So this was my favorite of the 8 stories, The Sapling Cage by Margaret Killjoy. I think it depicts a really beautiful idea of community and of a world we could live in where we're caring for one another and where we are looking at those in power and saying, we don't respect you simply because of your power. We respect you for how you treat others, right? And if that involves a little bit of anarchism, then so be it. But I think I'm going to end it there. This has gone on long enough. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you read any of these 8 novels or anything by these authors before? What do you think of the shortlist this year? Is it a good shortlist? Any of your thoughts, ideas, I'd love to hear them down below in the comments. As I said, when the award is announced, which will be on the 21st of October, so depending on when you watch this video, that may have already been announced, I will pin a comment down below announcing who won and putting a link to the official website describing all that. But other than that, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.